You may be wondering, what on earth happened to the Whitehouse? Why are those two Brits burning it? And what did they do to all of these buildings too? Well, I'm the Redcoat historian, and this is the War of 1812. But before we can get to Brits burning Washington, we first need to find out why on earth did Britain and America start fighting in the first place? In 1792, the French decided that having a king was no longer cool. One thing leads to another, and before you know it, most of Europe is at war with France. And because of this war, the British were having a bit of trouble finding enough manpower for their ships, and thus resorted to, well, borrowing some manpower. Private Johnson, what on earth do you think you're doing on this boat? Yeah, but my name's Sam. Who on earth are you anyways? Deserting your crew. Disgraceful. You're coming with me. Boys, get him. But I've never been on your ship in my life. What did I do? This is called impressment, which involved the British going up to random American ships, forcefully conscripting a bit of the crew, and leaving. It was a tactic which, obviously, wasn't too popular with the American government. Further dragging the Americans closer to war, the British and the French each wrote down a bunch of treaties, which had the effect of forcing the USA to pick only one to trade with. In an attempt to stop them both from pushing America around, Thomas Jefferson introduced the Embargo Act, which banned all, yes, all foreign trade. This was the geopolitical equivalent of someone breaking into your house to murder you, but before they can, you go and, not if I do it first. What? The universal embargo absolutely destroyed the US economy, and in the end the whole plan was scrapped for the Non-Intercourse Act, which only banned trade with France and Britain. However, that one went just as badly, so it got replaced by the May 1810 bill, which reopened trade with both Britain and France. But if one agreed to officially recognize American neutrality, they would re-embargo the other, and Napoleon, seeing this, jumped at the opportunity, pushing America ever closer to war with Britain. As well as wanting an end to trade restrictions and impressment, the Americans wanted one other thing too: Canada. And not solely because it would make their colour on the map bigger. The Americans felt that Canada was to blame for one other problem they had. While America at least nominally controlled all of this land, it was de facto under the control of a variety of different native tribes. But their lands were being slowly chipped away at by American settlers, a fact that didn't go down too well with them, and thus two came forth with a solution: Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, the Prophet. Together they united the tribes and set up a multi-tribe confederacy in the Midwest to defend against the Americans, and also began a campaign of looting, raiding, and pillaging local settlements. Governor Harrison of the Indiana Territory naturally wasn't too happy about all of this unrest, but when he found out that Tecumseh, the better general of the two, was going to be gone for a while, he gathered his troops and marched into native land. Then, after the short but fierce battle of Tippecanoe, he burnt Tecumseh's capital, Prophetstown. Where the British come into all of this is that the Americans thought that the Canadians were responsible for encouraging the natives to do all of this. And while no official support had been given, Governor Brock of Upper Canada had been experimenting with the idea of augmenting his army with natives. After he found his capital destroyed, Tecumseh felt that the only hope for his Confederacy survival lay with the British, and thus marched his remaining men north to Canada to join them. Because of all these reasons, on the 18th of June 1812, the government of the United States declared war on the British Empire. The British would eventually get round to burning down Washington. However, that would only happen towards the end of the war, so you better watch the entire video if you want to see that. At the very beginning of the war, pro-war riots broke out in Baltimore in order to destroy anti-war Federalist newspaper merchants that even went as far as bringing in a cannon to threaten them with. On the strategic end of things, the Americans believed that taking over Canada would be, as Thomas Jefferson once said, a matter of mere marching. And this almost seemed fair. After all, the British were distracted by the Napoleonic Wars and could spare few resources to fight a war in Canada. The Americans made their plans. They would roll over Canada, British forces wouldn't be able to land to retaliate. Victory. So, did the reality in any way resemble this? No, not even close. The attacks were in no way synchronized, and were overall very poorly conducted. Let's look at some examples, shall we? General Dearborn couldn't convince the state government of Maine to give him control over their militia, resulting in his planned 1812 offensive into Canada just not happening. General Hull did cross over from Detroit into Upper Canada, and from there he made a speech in an attempt to make the local population rise up against, from his point of view, their British oppressors. Needless to say, it didn't work. Worsening the situation, the British, along with their native ally Tecumseh and his men, managed to capture Fort... I'm sorry, but What kind of a word is that? By pointing a cannon at the fort from the heights overlooking it and saying, "If I were you, I'd run!" Worse yet, the Yanks also lost the battles of Brownstown and Frenchtown, putting their supply lines under threat. These American losses severely scared General Hull and convinced him that he was outnumbered, resulting in him retreating back to Fort Detroit. Seeing this, General Brock and Tecumseh each gathered a few more troops and chased after him, encircling the fort and capturing it without a fight. The capture of Fort Detroit gave the British and Tecumseh control over most of Michigan, and they would just keep on advancing until they lost the siege of Fort Wayne, putting the front on stalemate for a year. The day prior to Fort Detroit's fall, while the Americans were evacuating Fort Dearborn, modern-day Chicago, their convoy was ambushed by native warriors who proceeded to massacre the civilians in it, many of whom were children. Meanwhile, about a month later, on the other side of Upper Canada, the Americans attempted to advance into Canada over the Niagara River, resulting in the famous Battle of Queenston Heights. The battle started with the Americans making a hard-fought landing on the south side of Queenston, which almost failed, until one company of Americans landed a bit further downstream, then got round the rest of the defences and captured the British artillery on the heights. General Brock, realising that if they didn't get that gun back, they were done for, quickly gathered a detachment of troops and launched an attack up the hill, in which he got shot in the chest and died instantly. So his lieutenant took over from him, but then he got shot too. Seeing this, the British retreated to regroup. Now, the British had just lost the fight, but they had certainly not lost the battle, because a short while later, General Sheaffe arrived with an absolute boatload of reinforcements, which he then used to launch an absolutely devastating onslaught against the Americans, pushing them further and further back towards the cliff's edge, with some Americans even jumping over it, rather than face the wrath of Tecumseh's warriors. Seeing his troops almost at the breaking point, General Stephen Van Rensselaer tried to get his militia to cross the river in order to help them. But I said, cross the river! Nah, nope. Not my problem. Not happening. Did not me. After failing to either reinforce or withdraw their forces, the Americans were forced to simply surrender. It was an absolutely massive British victory. However, had come at the loss of their best general in Upper Canada, a loss which would very much come back to bite them later. But while the Americans were doing horrendously on land, in an ironic twist, it wasn't in fact Britannia that was ruling the waves, but Yankee land instead, with the USS Constitution for the entire duration of the war rampaging around the seven seas, sinking several British ships, such as the HMS Java, a loss which even got the British government concerned enough to pass laws prohibiting one-to-one engagements. Speaking of the British government, at the start of the year 1813, they finally declared war on the USA. But wait a minute, they've been fighting for ages. How did they just get around to doing that now? Well, back in the day, communication between continents relied on the postman crossing the entire Atlantic Ocean, and was thus very slow, a fact which would later result in an entire battle happening after a peace treaty for the war had been signed. Anyways, 1813 was also the year that the Americans made the New Year's resolution to stop being bad at war, and thus got a new Secretary of War, who began re-evaluating the American strategy. But while he was getting things organized, the Americans suffered one of their worst defeats of the whole war. Well, apart from that one, but we'll get to it later. In summary, on January the 18th, 1813, the Americans attempted to recapture Michigan, and it seemed to be going great at first, with them successfully capturing Frenchtown, until they got jumped by the British during the night, and their whole force got either killed or captured. The natives were set to guard over the prisoners of war, but they weren't too fond of them, and thus abused them severely. Neither were they too fond of the locals, and thus abused them severely. The whole event would become known to the Americans as the River Raisin Massacre, and the phrase "remember the raisin" become a battle cry among Americans, which they would use in a later battle where they would finally bring down Tecumseh. On the 27th of April, the Americans decided that it was their turn to win, and thus crossed over Lake Ontario and landed outside the town of York, modern-day Toronto, and took it. Just like that. The capture of York was a major victory for the Americans, and a long overdue morale boost for them too. But the victory was not without its casualties, because while the British were withdrawn, they destroyed all the supplies that they couldn't bring with them, including in one case a very large quantity of gunpowder. I'm sure this will have no unforeseen consequences, and the explosion accidentally killed one of the American generals, as well as 200 other men. The Americans were not too pleased, and in a fit of outrage, the remaining troops sought out revenge and began sacking the town, looting shops and destroying public buildings. While a tactical victory for the Americans, they had lost a general and had to withdraw back to their prior positions anyway. Meanwhile, they had seriously angered the British, who would seek their revenge in many different ways. For one, they attempted to raid the American port town of Sackett's Harbor, which resulted in the destruction of many American supplies and ships. They also started their raiding campaign on the Atlantic coastline around this time too. And finally, they would sack Washington, D.C. Before they could get round to that, they first needed to secure their supply lines against the Americans, and thus raided the town of Ogdensburg to kick out the American garrison, which had been harassing their supply lines. They also had a bit of a problem to deal with when the Yanks captured Fort George. However, they failed to destroy the garrison, which was able to flee practically unscathed. So they sent out a force to destroy them, which promptly got routed in the Battle of Stony Creek. A few more attempts like this would be made to advance further north, all of which would end similarly. In other news, about 2 months after this, Fort Mims was burnt to a crisp. Fort Mims? Hang on. Fort Mims is down there, and all the fighting has been happening up here. How on earth did that one happen? Let's rewind a bit. The Americans had been attempting to integrate the native populations in their southern land by encouraging them to adopt agriculture and thus free up lots of previous hunting ground for white settlers. And while some in the Creek tribe assimilated, others did not, and thus got the collective name Red Sticks, who would go around pillaging local settlers and White Sticks. And on August the 30th, 1813, they took things just a bit too far, and attacked Fort Mims, burning the fort, destroying the garrison, and slaughtering the civilians inside. This action got the Americans slightly irritated, and soon neighbouring state militias were mobilised to deal with them, beginning what is known as the Creek War, which would have both British and Spanish involvement. Meanwhile, back up in Canada, the Americans decided that they wanted to have control over Lake Erie, sparking the largest naval battle of the entire war. This'll be easy, we'll crush them, Britannia rules the waves, am I right? Sir? I said rules the waves, not the lakes! The Americans won a decisive victory in the Battle of Lake Erie, giving them naval supremacy over it. Realizing his supply lines were now under serious threat, General Proctor decided to retreat, much to the dismay of Tecumseh, as he didn't want to just abandon all of that land without a fight. General Harrison, seeing this retreat, began to rapidly pursue after them. They kept on retreating and retreating, until Proctor finally decided that he'd had enough, and on October the 5th, he finally decided to make a stand in the Battle of Thames. And for Tecumseh, it really would be his last stand. American infantry engaged the natives right, while cavalry was able to quickly rout the British, causing them to flee, leaving just Tecumseh and his troops. The cavalry then turned north and engaged Tecumseh's left, and it was in the midst of this fray that Colonel Johnson was shot at and charged by a Shawnee warrior, who he promptly shot. And with that shot, Tecumseh dropped dead. Or at least that's how the story goes. I don't know. We can't be completely sure if that one's true or not. Either way, Tecumseh's dead now. The news quickly spread among their ranks, causing morale to disappear and complete retreat to happen. And while Tecumseh fell, so with him his dream of a native confederacy. While the Americans did have to fall back to the river, since the terrain up here wasn't great for defending, they had just routed the British, eliminated the Confederacy, and captured a bunch of forts for very little effort. It was by far their greatest victory of the war so far, and even caused many tribes to immediately seek peace. To follow up this great victory, the Americans had 2 more cracks at invading Lower Canada, but they couldn't keep up the win streak forever, and both of these were humiliating defeats. For the rest of 1813, aside from both sides doing some general war crime stuff in the area around Fort George, and Andrew Jackson beating the Creeks, nothing much really happened. But at the dawn of 1814, however, the Americans took over Fort Erie, defeated the British counterattack, and then tried to advance further north, but were stopped at Lundy's Lane. And the following battle saw some of the most intense and brutal fighting of the whole war, with a furious bayonet brawl breaking out over the hill with the British artillery positioned on. However, by the evening, both sides were too badly battered to continue fighting, and thus decided, you want to go home? Yeah, I'm going home. This is stupid. And thus decided to just go home, which in many ways was quite symbolic of the war as a whole. With both sides realizing they couldn't advance much further, they began to meet in Ghent for peace negotiations. Speaking of peace treaties, you know which one had just been signed? The Treaty of Paris. Wait, scroll down. Yeah, that one. Ending the Napoleonic Wars and exiling the man responsible for them to Elba. For now. This freed up thousands of veteran British troops, who were now able to go and beat up the Yanks. So the ships set sail for Chesapeake Bay, and when they had arrived, 4,500 British troops made a landing in Benedict, Maryland, who then marched north, had a slight scuffle in the Battle of Bladensburg, which they won, and then marched a bit further north, until they finally got to Washington, which they proceeded to torch. Businesses and civilians were mostly ignored during the sacking, but government ones, oh boy, government ones! As I have already mentioned far too many times, the British torched the White House, so badly in fact, that the reason it was painted white in the first place was to cover up the damage done by the fire. Allegedly at least, that one's quite likely a myth. They also torched the Capitol, the Treasury, the Library of Congress. They destroyed everything, except the patent office, since the guy running it convinced them that burning the inventions inside would be a loss for humanity as a whole. I even heard they are on their way right now to torch your house. And the only way to stop them is to like the video, subscribe, beg for mercy in the comments section, and go over to my PayPal and donate a bit of money to try and bribe them into going away. Jokes aside, I do genuinely appreciate all of you who take the time to watch my schizophrenic rants. The problem is, I don't make a penny off of these. I'm nowhere close to being monetized, and it's kind of hard to keep up the motivation and justify the time I spend on these videos, writing, researching, whatever. So, if you could donate, I would very much appreciate it. You don't have to, I'm not saying you have to, but I would really appreciate it. Anyways, sellout time's over. The plan was to conduct major raids like this all the way up the East Coast to demoralize the American population enough that they would sue for peace more easily. So thus, after decimating Washington, they turned their sights on Baltimore. However, they had difficulties getting there. Fort McHenry just refused to break, even withstanding a fierce naval bombardment. And eventually, they just gave up and left. This bombardment was actually poet Francis Scott Key's inspiration for writing the poem The Defense of Fort McHenry, which would become the lyrics of the American national anthem. Anyways, that really was one of the last major events of the war, aside from two others. For one, the Brits decided that they would have a crack at invading Maine through a joint land-navy operation in the Battle of Plattsburgh. Okay boys, we may not have been doing too well navally speaking this war so far, but I'm really feeling this one. We're gonna crush them, boys. Sing it with me. Rule Britannia! Sir? Bunch of cheaters. They were once again beaten on the water, and without naval support, the attack was called off, resulting in an American victory, which would prove very useful in the peace conference. Speaking of which, a mere month later on Christmas Day, or Christmas Eve depending where you're from, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, ending the war. But wait, I said two more events, and I've only mentioned one and the war's over already. Well, remember how earlier I said back in the day news travelled very slowly? Well, before the British forces could find out that the war was over, they had already launched a little bit of an invasion into Louisiana. Hearing of this, future President Andrew Jackson, after signing the Treaty of Fort Jackson ending the Creek War, marched south to New Orleans to defend against the British. He then began to fortify the small canal in front of the town. Then, after a few days and a few skirmishes, the British made their move and advanced on the American line. And it was here that everything began to go horribly wrong for them. As they advanced, the fog they were using to conceal themselves disappeared. Furthermore, their attempt to take over one of the American artillery batteries was delayed, resulting in the Americans' job becoming less difficult than shooting a fish in a barrel. So they fired their guns and the British kept it coming, and there wasn't as many as there was a while ago. Then they fired once more and they began to run down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of the American force didn't even speak English. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and otherwise had absolutely no right to win the Battle of New Orleans. But somehow did. And the victory, despite occurring after the war had ended, was still a massive morale boost for the Americans. So I know the question you're currently asking. Who won the war? Well, it's complicated. If you ask a Brit or a Canadian, they will say, "We won!" Since they had successfully defended Canada and sacked Washington. If you ask an American, they will say, since they had successfully held their own against the British Empire and won the Battle of New Orleans. But if you ask a Native American, they will say that they most certainly did not win, since they had lost their last hope for their own state. And a matter of decades later, they would all largely be deported to Indiana in the Trail of Tears. In the peace negotiations, the British tried to convince the Americans to give them the Midwest to set up a client state for natives. However, considering that they occupied practically none of this, the plan was scrapped, and thus they both decided to just go back to the pre-war border and pretend that nothing had happened. So, did the war achieve anything at all? Well, the war played a key part in forging the Canadian national identity, separate from Britain. It also made the world take the USA a bit more seriously as a country, as well as convince the Americans to start spending a bit more on their army, since the whole militia thing proved itself to not really work. An increase in military spending, which culminated in this map here. And the final consequences of this war is that it has kept me awake for far too long, writing, researching, animating, all the other stuff. I give up on, I'm not reading the script anymore. Get rid of you. I'm just ranting because I'm an angry boy. You see, you know what? This is the third time I've had to redo this voiceover because it didn't work the last 2 times, okay? I am seriously angry. I want to go to bed. Goodbye.